Welcome to the Orthogonal Bet, where we explore the weird and wonderful ideas that shape our world. It's a cabinet of curiosities for the ears and the mind. I'm your host, Samuel Arbisman, complexity scientist, author, and scientist in residence at Lux Capital. In this episode, I had the pleasure to speak with Rohit Krishnan. Rohit is one of the most fun thinkers I know. He loves playing with ideas and writes Strange Loop Canon, a newsletter devoted to so many delightful concepts, including artificial intelligence. Rohit also recently worked on a project along with John Evans called Walter, where an AI was trained to be good at social media. Rohit and I had a chance to discuss Walter, as well as why LLMs are so bad at good writing, even though they are text-based machines. But we also talked about so much more, including reinforcement learning for writing, useful metaphors for LLMs such as, quote, fuzzy processors, whether focusing on the alienness of AIs is a useful activity, nurturing AI, and even using AI in one's job and life, and what this means for the future of work. Is it going to be like a video game? And the need to keep on playing with these systems. This conversation was a blast, and I had so much fun chatting with Rohit. Let's jump in. Rohit, great to be talking with you. Welcome to the Orthogonal Bet.
Sounds good, man.
Yeah, this is exciting.
It's amazing to be here.
Yeah, I have so many different directions we can go in. I want to start though, and maybe we can kind of like spiral outwards from there, about one of your newest projects, Walter. I want to hear about what prompted that and what is this project?
Okay, so Walter is a slightly quixotic project to be trying out, I feel like, in 2025. And it's that for two reasons. One is that it is trying to make, okay, let me step back. AI is getting really good at doing all sorts of stuff. It does huge chunks of my work right now. It does huge chunks of most people's work. There's some academic research out saying people are not even going to get jobs anymore as junior developers and things like that. So it's getting really good, right? I mean, all skepticism aside for a second. But one thing that it undeniably does badly is writing. And that's just like a fact. Because anytime somebody who writes gets LLM to write for you, it's really bad. Put all of that together, and the fact that these alien creatures that are made of words are really bad at writing words in the way that we would want them to, but are somehow much better at writing C++ code is just really weird. And it was one of those things where I was like, okay, so if we could get an LLM to write a little bit better, wouldn't that be nice? That was the kind of the genesis of the thought. And obviously, like with all of these thoughts, we started out with something much grander as the idea, saying can we get it to write like an article? News, if you read news in any of the websites, you might have a preference towards reading none of it and then saying I want to write my own. Everybody's gone through the same thing. So we could say could we do the same thing? And as this thought slowly evolved, the question became, okay, we have methods now to do verifiable rewards if you're teaching it to do math or code or whatever. Because the code either compiles or it doesn't. It's fairly easy. You can do step-by-step checks. It gives you error messages. Maths is similar. Whatever, physics is similar. If you want to teach a robot how to walk, whether it walks or not is relatively clear. You don't need to you don't need to guess about it. Writing is not like that, right? You don't really have too many reward signals that come your way about whether you did something well. So the thing that started out was okay, there is this entire domain of non-easily verifiable problems, which are mostly the problems that humans deal with in their lives, writing being one subset of it. And the question is it feasible to design a reward model such that this could be fun to create?
Okay.
And more importantly, entirely because I'm GPU poor, is could you do this without needing a trillion parameter? Could you make something better? And that's the genesis. And the idea was all right, let's try it out and see if it works.
And you ended up building something that plays on social media. And did it? I mean, I remember, reading the paper and your own stuff. There was the early version, the untrained version where it's just nothing but hashtags that are all the same kind of over and over, which is entertaining and kind of sweet in its own way. And there's the more trained version, which is still pretty hashtag heavy. Did it feel like a success? I mean, and presumably you learned a whole bunch in doing it, but so I guess, what did you learn? Did you feel like it was a success? And what is kind of are there next steps or you were okay, this is a fun little.
So in the limited aims that we had, I think it's a success because you can clearly see the gradient getting better. That's good. Number two is we didn't sort of reinforcement learn for so long that it overtook the innate annoying trait that all of these models have to do hashtags. It is just frustrating as hell, but they all do it, right? I mean, they all do it because somehow in their pre-training, this has been shoved into them and you can barely stop them from doing it. That's fine. But the interesting thing that we found is like, even with a small model and a small modicum of reinforcement learning, assuming the right kind of rewards, you can actually start getting them better at writing. So why social media was entirely a function of where you could get data. So for example, the interesting thing about social media, in this case, we use Blue Sky data, was because like you could get a firehouse of information where people read the same article and posted different takes about that article, summary, whatever. And you could have a ranking reward system that you somehow create at the back of it saying like, hey, these people actually really liked this particular take and these people didn't. Problem obviously is that it's extremely noisy, like social media always is. But the question is, within that noise, is there enough signal that you could actually get better at it? And it's a personal question in some ways, right? Because like, I mean, I've had a Twitter account for a decade and a half or whatever, but I've really used it maybe for 5 years. And in the beginning part of 5 years, this was the best part of Twitter. Like people would post links and have genuine takes or discussions about them. And then you would actually get interested or not interested. And I'm sure there's a sea of, bots out there that would annoy you, but it was not nearly problematic enough because there was enough signal in there. So from sort of the question was, could the model discover that signal just from the amount of data that you're actually able to capture? And the answer turned out to be yes. So that part is success. Like if you look at some of the examples, because these are small models, they go crazy. Like if they're talking about SpaceX, they just like go hashtag SpaceX and they just go through infinity, or it just like degrades very quickly.
Right.
And you could train it out of them, right? It starts writing sensible tweets. It still sounds a little Walter Cronkite for my taste, but that's fine. I count that as a massive success. The next step is there's a bunch of different ways that I'm trying to play around with it. So one is to say, let's take non-social media external data sources. So let's take the best poetry and prose and documents that actually exist. So like I download a bunch of speeches, a bunch of poems that I like, a bunch of novels that I like, a bunch of short stories, and kind of say like these short stories, like Hemingway has a particular way of writing. And while models, even the good models, can do pastiche of Hemingway, it really doesn't capture some sort of an essence.
Do you mean like it's much more like this very like surface level kind of thing? Like you read it and you're like, oh yeah, that feels like Hemingway-esque. And then when you start digging a little bit more deeply, you're like, okay, this is
not really.
This is like it's a fun like party trick, but it's not. It doesn't feel like
correct.
Like deeply.
It's a little bit like, if you wanted to write like Shakespeare, it might be able to get closer to iambic pentameter, but it's not going to get Friends, Romans, Countrymen, right? Because that has some pattern to it. So the question is, can you extract patterns from the best writing that you can download of any sort? It can be token surprisal patterns, because like Dickinson poems quite often have sudden changes in the probability of the next token prediction, if you want to get it, because she has very interesting moves that she makes. Or P.G. Wodehouse, his phrases are very unexpected, which is one of the joys of them. And like, if you take the highest next token probability, you're not going to get the thing that he's going for.
Saying like to mimic him, you would have to like tune the temperature like really down and then like really up and kind of like back and forth in order to kind of.
Either you got to do that back and forth, you got to change the sampling every now and then, you got to change the sampling over a word, a phrase, a sentence, etc. But the interesting thing is like, if you're able to kind of do this a little bit, and it's early days, then you can get it to write better poetry. It's still not good yet. I will preface by saying that, but you can already start getting it to do better poetry than what it did before. The images are crisper, the changes are more interesting. So the hypothesis here is that like, this is a static data set, but there's information you can gain from it and assess against the data that you produced, the poem that you produced, such that you can create a gradient and train it to actually generate better writing. Because ultimately, the question still remains the same. Like, why are these models not writing better? It is a exceedingly frustrating I think it is a fairly deep question because there's no logical reason it shouldn't.
Right. Because I can almost see the same kind of thing where you could just say, okay, like you say, write a poem or generate something, and then it gives you something that's kind of mediocre, and you say, now do a better job. And oftentimes, many of these systems will then do a better job. But you're saying, at least when it comes to writing prose or poetry, it doesn't actually work for that. It works very well for code or some other kind or problems, like certain types of like problem solving, but not for just text itself.
I don't think it does. And I mean, there are many, many layers of reasons why. But one, I think, is that poetry, prose that we like are a very intriguing subset of human creation. Like if you think about the sum total of stuff that you write, papers in school, reports for work, emails, most of those are ones where you focus exceedingly on things like clarity, how quickly can you get a piece of information across? It's all very crisp and clean, which are non-paradoxically the things that the models are actually pretty decent at, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but a large chunk of the emails I get these days are LLM generated. And you can kind of tell, like, oh yeah, that was a 4.0 effort, or this was a Claude effort. You can kind of tell. And you judge people on the basis of that. But the poetry and prose is, it takes in a large amount of information, a worldview that the author usually has, and tries to push it through some narrow aperture such that it retains some of those same facets. Like when you read a piece of poetry, there is a certain image that comes into your mind that is perhaps somewhat analogous to the image that exists in the poet's mind. But that bringing forth that image is part of the reason for writing poetry. It's not to like give you a very specific piece of information, right? It's not telling you, hey, Sam, when you read this poem, you should think about this. Like, because that would be very easy to say.
Right.
But I don't know about you, but when my English teacher would tell me things like that, I'd get really upset.
Well, so I guess is the argument you're making then that in the realm of, let's say, code and mathematics, the vast majority of text that is related to those things is getting the job done for the kinds of things that we actually care about. While at least when it comes to just plain text, the vast majority of text that these systems are being trained on are not actually generating. The text is not actually good writing. It's just writing. And maybe because of the fact that we generate so much of it and most of it is mediocre at best, therefore it is that much harder for the system to actually generate the good stuff. Is that kind of the argument?
That is exactly the argument. Because if you think about it from a Brandon Sanderson perspective, the famous fantasy author, he has a very methodical, mechanistic view of writing. Like, you create the world like this, and then you create magic systems that cut across certain rules. Then every chapter needs to have this happen, and then this happen, and then this happen. I remember sort of several years ago seeing one of his lectures on YouTube. And it was amazing because like he treats it, it's almost like an architecture diagram that he draws for any novel that he wants to write. Now, the interesting thing is like, because of this, number one, his books are eminently readable, understandable, and undeniably sort of quite good. Or maybe not undeniably, but his detractors will say that it has no heart. Okay. So it's almost like the exact opposite does apply, where, people say like, no, compared to whatever George R.R. Martin, whose novels go all over the place and, maybe will never get finished, but it has a lot of some human soul heart heft inside there. Some pattern that exists inside ourselves has been captured in the page that is not easily breakdownable into the same sort of rigid structures and patterns that might actually exist. Now, you and I, we've talked about this before with respect to code. Like, you can write code beautifully. You can also write code pedestrian, like normal, workman-like fashion. And if you talk to senior engineers who are using AI to generate their code, one of their biggest annoyances is the fact that it does not write beautiful code. It is funny how that is the case, because they're like,
it's the same kind of thing of like the vast majority of code is probably not going to be beautiful. Like at least what it's training on.
They're like, the code works. That's great. But like, we didn't write it well enough. It should have refactored this like this. I would have done it in a different way so that and those are all useful inputs, but they are all indicative of the fact that it doesn't it's very workman-like. And I think part of especially these days, the models are all reinforcement learning trained, which means they get really good at doing the thing that they're taught to do. It's a little bit like teaching to the test, with math, with whatever code, with things that can be easily verified, they can demonstrably get better at doing that thing. The whole question is like, can you transform that reward function, that method in some way such that it can get better at things that are not easily verifiable? Because I think, to me, this is a giant gap that we will have to jump through at some point in the next few years if we want to get to AGI.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my question with this is like, all right, like going back to like the need for like reinforcement learning for these kinds of things is like, there's not necessarily a clear gradient for some of these kinds of things. Of like,
there isn't.
And that's and even with like social media, kind of like the system Walter, like it's not entirely clear what makes a good social media sentence or whatever. And oftentimes those sentences are going to be a little bit more workmanlike. They're not necessarily going to be these beautifully crafted things, or the ones that are beautifully crafted, they might just sink without a trace. Maybe I'm wrong. I would say, yeah. And so Yeah, it's a
I mean,
weird
that's
situation.
true, right? Like people talk all the time about how their well-crafted tweets die and like their off-the-cuff random stuff goes viral.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's happened to me. I'm sure it's happened to you. It's not a pleasant feeling because it almost feels like you found some cheat code into the general latent space of everybody's minds. But then the question in my mind is almost that like if a model can learn language and philosophy and math and code and science and it can diagnose disease, all of which it can do reasonably well, nothing perfect, blah blah, I'm not making any claims, but all of which it can do reasonably well, we should be able to teach a model to write better. This is my sole contention, and my higher order contention is that teaching a model to write better is a fundamental constraint towards creating a model that actually does remarkably well in all sorts of other domains. Because it would be a way that like it has learned to go beyond the surface level and probably go several layers deep into whatever it actually wants to communicate. That it has a worldview that it wants to communicate that is then get pushed through some sort of an aperture.
So like,
Or it is
basically like good writing is some sort of, it's like the symptom of better thinking. Is that kind of what you're saying?
I think that is the Paul Graham way of saying it. I don't know whether I fully agree, but I think I do actually.
Okay. I mean, because and the counter argument, which I'm not sure I agree with this, is like when I remember like learning in undergrad where like a professor would talk about some philosopher and they'd say, oh, this philosopher's writing is like really difficult to unpack. And I'm like, just say what you mean, which is they're a really bad writer. And like, so clearly there can be good thinkers who are terrible writers. That being said, I agree that like you need to have good writing alongside the good thinking. Like they're not there is a little bit of kind of like a way to like tease these things apart. You can have like really good thinking, but then really bad writing. Though my argument would be like it's actually not as good thinking because they haven't gotten a good way to actually explain it. But I mean, I wonder, is there a larger question though of, is this actually a good thing? Like, do we want these systems to write really well, or is this something that we want to preserve for humans, or am I just kind of like basically just arguing against the maelstrom of like these things are going to happen anyway?
So I think these things are going to happen anyway. So that is
Yeah.
I feel like I started off by saying quixotic. I think this is perhaps the most quixotic belief we have that we can kind of hold it back. So that exists. However, I think the way I think about it is a bit more mechanistic in the sense that like what we have learned using sort of all the magic from 2017 onwards is that with large amounts of data, we have some architecture that can learn all sorts of, smart, dumb, insidious, overt patterns that exist in the data. It can do that. And it did that most dramatically by sort of the anti-Chomskyan argument of it learned to speak.
Right.
Like I'm still surprised every now and then by the fact that no matter what I talk to a model about, it does not make a grammatical mistake, which is like, if you think about it, it's very, because I make grammatical mistakes and I've been speaking in English for like 40 years. This is, I'm fairly well read. I write and I make mistakes all the time, but the models don't, which is fascinating. So it has learned some pattern that existed inside, the general documentation that existed in English language and other languages around the world, such that it is able to. So the question becomes, okay, if it is able to do that, can it similarly identify patterns in other areas such that it can actually provide things that are interesting to us? Now, your second question of like, is it a good thing? I don't know. I don't know that we have a balance here about whether something is good or not. I think what we do have is the idea that we kind of gonna have to do it one way or the other because this is the inevitable march progress towards. But the hopeful part of me kind of says that if we get models better at writing certain things, maybe that will push us to get better at writing other things or creating different kinds of art. I have no idea what that might be. I make no claim to kind of what that might be, but I am reasonably confident that it will get there. Like the example might be like you write really good nonfiction books.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
Right? Now, nonfiction books are this weird category where it used to serve a bunch of different purposes and that has kind of changed over time. If you think about a nonfiction book from like 20 years ago, 30 years ago, they might be, popularizing a concept is a big part of it. But like it usually had to give you a large data dump because you just wouldn't know otherwise.
Right.
Whereas as time went on, it could be that like you can assume some base level of knowledge. So you don't need to do data dumps anymore. And if you do data dumps, it'll get seen as boring because you're like, why are you telling me this? If I care, I can read Wikipedia.
Right. Yeah.
if in the AI world, that gets pushed even further because there's a certain set of things where you might almost want a, Tyler Cowen like one paragraph, because that's all you need. Because if you want to know anything more, you can go find out for yourself or go have a conversation with a model or whatever. So it pushes us towards different forms of expression. Again, making no balance as to whether this is good or bad. I think it is interesting because it's the only way we level up, right?
That's interesting. I mean, I do like this idea. I mean, there is some worry about, right, like different, like whether or not we're kind of abandoning certain types of expression, but I like this idea of pushing us towards different kinds of expression where it's right as these systems get better for doing lots of different things, right? There's other forms of artistic expression, and that's not necessarily a bad thing to kind of constantly push us to think about those things.
I think it's important because I feel like just like, when plays kind of came to I wouldn't say dead end, but at least a lower art form or a lesser art form as it exists today, maybe not even lesser, less common art form as it exists today, or like opera became less common. There's a bunch of other things that came up, many of them technologically enabled. And whether you want to call it, whether it's movies or animation or whatever in whatever sphere is in Las Vegas, I don't even know what to call it, immersive experience or something.
Yeah.
Like there's a set of things that we are going to be able to do that we just couldn't do before. I think one of my favorite examples here is animation, because like Midsummer Night's Dream, as performed in whatever 17th, 18th century, it was to them what animation is to us, because it is a fantastical story that is set with whatever music. It had a certain, performers that kind of put that story in front of people. Today, you can sort of do that and much more with animation because there is no bound in your imagination. And
Okay.
I don't know if it is better. In fact, most people would probably say it's not better, but I do contend that it is a different art.
That's interesting. Okay, so going back to AI and LLMs, a while, and I guess not even that not long ago, you wrote about like the metaphor, like your useful metaphor of for AI and thinking about LLMs is as this like fuzzy processor, kind of like a computational processor. Do you still believe that? Like, is that still sort of the metaphor that you grab for when you're thinking about these systems now, or has your thinking evolved there?
I think the metaphor has, perhaps surprisingly to me, also like stood the test of time a little bit,
Okay.
because they are like, even when you use GPT-5 high or whatever the number is, they are still fuzzy processors that have had chipsets put around them in some ways. So we are getting towards building a full computer. Because if you extract out and take a look at what these reasoning models do, for example, they have a substrate layer, which is the fuzzy processor, which is the LLM. You ask a question and you get a response. And then all other bits of work that you do is effectively training that processor to give you better response in some ways, right? So you would say like, no, don't give me a response now. Do like 1,000 loops and then give me a response. Maybe not 1,000, maybe 10, whatever the high number is. I don't even know what they kind of put it in there. It is equivalent to some internalized chain of thought in order for it to provide a better answer. Now, we don't do that with normal processors because processors are deterministic, but we do have some of them, like when you send something into space, you need 3 to do error correction or whatever it might be. But it is a processor in the sense that you throw in a bunch of information, and based on some mathematical computation that happens here, you're going to get some level of information that is coming out on the other side. And that transformation, that processing is still, to me, a very useful metaphor to kind of ask it. The intriguing question in some sense is that, or where this might break down is at some point you might say, okay, it's not just processing it. In some ways, because of the number of things that it's doing inside, it stopped processing and started generating or something. I don't know. There's a different verb that you might actually start throwing around there. But the way I think about it, at least, is that that's a function of the chipset. You have to do a whole bunch of stuff around it. You have to teach it to use tools. So suddenly it's not just one processing run, but it is using a bunch of different things within it such that it is able to give you a better answer. But at that point, I mean, we are barely dealing with actual simple LLM transformer methods like existed in 3.5 or whatever anymore, right? Because we've kind of well past that paradigm now. We are now using entire chips. Like they can do reasoning, they can do tool calls, they can search the internet, they can read documents. They're multimodal relatively by default by now. I mean, they can all do images and some of them can do video. They can take in, like, they have learned a bunch of these different modalities and like inscribe them into its own architecture such that it is able to kind of deal with it.
Does that, I mean, understanding that or kind of the metaphor, or how do you think about these things, or even just like the fact that it's kind of doing this loop, Does any of that change how you think about like how you do your own thinking? Like, is it one of these things where, oh, now I understand that it's constantly like asking it to kind of get better and better. I need to do the same thing as opposed to just giving an off the cuff answer. I need to kind of like, I don't know, have some sort of internal thinking, or like, do you think of yourself as multimodal in certain ways when you're working on different projects? I mean, have these metaphors or understanding of these systems changed how you've thought or how you think?
That's a really good question. I mean, inevitably, I think the answer is yes, even though I'm not entirely sure how to put my finger on it. Here's one example. Like way back in college when I first started playing poker, I had this belief then that I didn't want to sit and do pot odds and like calculations because that seemed boring. And the whole purpose of poker is to like have fun with friends and drink. But what would be great is if that like my theory then was that I'm effectively training my brain to output an action I need to take. So I don't need to think too much about it. I just needed to play a lot of poker. This is like, I don't know, early 2000s. And it worked well enough insofar in the sense that like playing with my friends who are also mostly drunk people my age, I'm like at evens. I'm not like a great player, but I didn't like lose a ton of money.
Yeah.
So I'm like, I don't know if I would count that as success. But now I think back to that and go like, oh, you were training yourself as like a autoregressive algorithm because you're just saying like there's a bunch of data and you're not going to actively use your system to whatever thinking. You're just going to output an action and see what happens. And it worked like for, I don't know, 7 years. So it was not like an insignificant amount of time either, but it was my fundamental paradigm of how I would approach these. Today, I think because now we have this metaphor that is so clearly good, occasionally I do find catching myself having an answer and then going like, you know what? Maybe I should do 2 more loops.
Yeah. But do like 3-ply thinking or something like
exactly
second order, third order thinking or whatever it is.
But you know what the thing is, right? I mean, it's like, what was that like quote or whatever that, in the old days, they discovered whatever hydraulics machines and they thought the world was hydraulics and they discovered computers and then everybody was
Right.
sure that. I wonder whether this is a little bit of like the metaphor poisoning my own kind of thinking. I don't know. I mean, I am semi worried about that because now we do have a machine that, like I said, speaks in perfect grammatical sentences and actually makes sense most of the time. And sans the extreme sycophancy is really good. So then I'm like, there's enough groups of people now thinking of this as a real conscious manifestation of some alien intellect that I'm kind of slightly suspicious of ascribing too many quantities to it or learning from it to change my own behaviors. But I do think about this. I think mostly I think about it doing physical things, I feel like, because the model can't do it. So, when I'm taking my kids to the park or running somewhere or something, occasionally the thing comes up of like, how would a model think about the sequence of actions? And it's a weird thought because in many ways it doesn't map cleanly into the latent space. Not yet.
Yeah. Well, and I think also, and you kind of mentioned about this, these like alien intellects or whatever. I like when there was like the like RLHF kind of stuff. Like when that first kind of came out, there was the whole like meme of like the Shoggoth with like the little like smiley face and like these things are really weird and we're kind of making them like human understandable. And I feel like I don't know if we've forgotten about that, but like I like to really lean into that. Like rather than saying, all right, like and metaphors are obviously very, very useful and like having some sort of like idea to hang all this infrastructure on is
right.
valuable. But these things are really weird. And I love to lean very much into that and see like where all these systems break and the edge cases. And maybe that makes them, maybe I, as a result, end up not finding as many use cases for them because I want to lean into the weirdness. But and do you think about like how much time do you spend on like the alienness? Like is there, or is that, how valuable is that?
There's 2 answers. One is that I spend a bunch of time trying to play with definitely smaller models for all these kinds of projects, but the base models particularly. And I think it is very useful to spend time with the base models because base models are weird. They are pure, like people say next token prediction machines, but they do not understand what next token prediction machines actually are. They're just really weird things because you ask it a question, then it'll keep on asking questions on the back of it or get stuck in loops because like it doesn't know what, it just has to predict something that comes next. I think that is a very useful counterbalance to over anthropomorphizing these kind of models and figuring out sort of a little bit more about how they work. Because I think it's useful to know a little bit about like, hey, we started out by creating these kind of base models. Then slowly we are sculpting them towards generating the kind of answers that we want to get out from them. And that it is a process, and these are probabilistic training methods. It is not guaranteed that like we will just get these kinds of outputs that we would want to get. I think that's a useful corrective function in general. The second part of the answer is, I think weirdness is useful in the sense that they're very spiky and they're fun to find, but it is exceedingly important to not fall only into the weirdness trajectory, because things are actually incredibly useful. So I think of, replicate.
Would this be like the equivalent of like, it's fun to think about optical illusions, and I love optical illusions, but like,
yes,
those are obviously the exceptions rather than the rule in terms of how we think about vision. Like, is that a similar kind of thing where it's like, these are fun, but like, don't necessarily spend all your time playing with optical illusions if you want to, I don't know, just look at the world properly.
Yeah, I think somewhat, yes. I mean, I was going to say, like, Replicate does a bunch of really interesting work trying to get to the weird corners of the latent space that exists inside these models. Like all complex systems, they have weird, strange attractors inside them, such that if you push them repeatedly in some direction, they'll get to some basin and repeatedly generate or talk about certain types of things and motifs and whatever. I think that is interesting. How instructive that is, I am exceedingly skeptical of. Because like, sure, you make two models talk to each other endlessly. If they go blissfully, they ends up in some motif about like candles and whatever, prayer circles. Okay, what does that tell you? I'm not sure it tells us all that much. Because if humans had the ability to map out the multidimensional landscape of all data that we actually have access to, all of internet, it wouldn't be uniform, right? Because nothing is. There would be sinks. The existence of sinks doesn't necessarily tell us a whole lot about the importance of those sinks or how quickly you fall into them or how quickly they're just there. They're true of everything. Right. It's any complex multidimensional structure will have sinks. So the fact that people say there are sinks is not instructive. The more interesting question is like, how do you get in and out of them, or how do you use them for something special? I don't know if that quite answers your thing.
I think so. And maybe the equivalent is like in the same way that, right, going back to the optical illusions, or just more broader, humans are weird, and like there's lots of weird little cognitive biases we have and things like that. And the question is, to what degree do these edges and corner cases and exceptions, to what degree do they rule our cognition, or is it just kind of things to be aware of? And sometimes they actually do rule our cognition, and we have to be aware of them. And I guess you can also even say the same kind of thing of like, yeah, maybe when we are first born, kind of like the base model of human brains is also super strange. And then we kind of like flatten it out through learning and language and growing up and things like that. I don't know, maybe that I'm really pushing that analogy too far and I've broken it, but there could be something there.
I think it's like you have kids similar age to mine. So like seeing them grow up, again, this might be the metaphor reinforcing itself, but like you do see that like they're born with, I used to keep a list actually of the innate abilities they were born with and when they got certain new ones. And I went back to it sometime recently. And it's interesting because in the beginning, I don't think they're blank slates per se, but they do have like, they basically can like, they're able to drink milk and like hold your finger or something. It's like very minimal sets. And then every single thing is something that they learned, right? How to focus their eyes to kind of see you is something they learn. Color comes a little bit after. I think it's not for the first several months or for several weeks that it actually comes up. Crawling, walking, like everything that we take for granted is something that comes up. Like my 4-year-old is reading now, and he's just started writing because his brother reads and writes. And like reading, he can now do.
That's amazing.
But when he writes, he just writes it phonetically. So he recently he's writing a story about some Spinosaurus. That's his favorite thing. And he said like it walked somewhere, and walked is like WOCT.
Right. Because he would have no trouble reading that.
Yeah, he has no trouble reading, but he hasn't connected those two things in his mind. And it will happen at some point.
Yeah.
But I had forgotten that these things were separate. You know what I mean? I was like, of course, if you know how to read, you know how to write.
These are like separate little modules. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it is interesting to see these things develop slowly. And I can see how, if you are in, Anthropic and you're training one of these models day in and day out, you have, like Amanda Askell or something, you have a paternalistic, maternalistic instinct towards thinking of them as these little intelligences that you nurture. I am very skeptical of it, but like it's like the old Douglas Adams speech about, dragons and feng shui, that dragons are obviously not real, but in our conceptualization, they are biological animals. And if you think about all the ways in which a dragon might dislike being inside a particular house. That if they turn this corner, it's too sharp, its tail might bump into that, or like that window is too bright in his eyes or whatever, then maybe it translates towards other organic creatures such as us ourselves. I always thought that was a wonderful sort of metaphor. I think something similar might apply here as well, that we are sort of accidentally getting them towards the things that we like, even though it's not true.
Huh. That's that's really thought provoking. So related to all these systems and these tools, and you use them much more. Like you're like very much on like the bleeding edge of like using these in your daily life. And maybe you can just give an explanation or like of how you use these things, because I feel like the way you talk about AI and these systems is very different from sort of the larger discussion and kind of like the broader, like in broader society of like, oh, how AI is going to change jobs and things like that. Like you're already there in many ways. And I don't know if it's like one of these things where like, oh, it's going to take like a decade for all of us to catch up to where you are, or we're going to all be like right behind you, but we just don't know that. Yeah. How do you think about incorporating it into your life?
First of all, that's very, very kind. A little too kind, but I will ignore it forthwith.
Well, I think it's accurate.
The mental model that I go with is that almost all problems, if I'm able to articulate it sufficiently well, then a model or some version of a model can actually solve it for me faster than I can do it for myself. And this is not true, but it is a useful model because it means that I test everything out immediately. I did this analysis, I want to say like a year ago now. Gosh, I did not realize it was that long ago, of checking my browser history and seeing whether I spend more time now with LLMs versus like, I did a bunch of categories and tested. And it was already higher with LLMs than everything else. Like this was a year ago. And now I'm scared to look. And now it won't be accurate as well, because like now I use CLI tools and blah, blah, blah. So this means that the default, like, do you remember the website? Let me Google that for you.
Yeah.
It exists, I'm sure. I feel like I am the, let me ask an AI for you for most things in life. And it will be wrong, which is fine. But you should still use this as your default next step for many things. So to give you a few like random examples, my monitor setup, I took pictures and asked the AI to help me figure out where to place different things and, cameras and so on, so that it's easier or more ergonomic. Because I was like, somebody needs to figure this out. Might as well be you, because I don't know anything about it. I did the same thing. And this is just in the last week. I did the same thing for my tax filings, because I have a bunch of receipts lying in a random folder that I had scanned. I was like, I need to rename them, itemize them, create a CSV out of them. So I did Codex CLI to kind of go off and do that for me. There are 4 or 5 things specifically that I wanted to learn more about. Some of them AI related, some of them related to a project, a couple of them related to history, all of which have long sequences of conversations with sort of LLMs on an ongoing basis. In fact, one of my continuing frustrations, while I'll just voice it while I'm going, is that ChatGPT on the mobile app, you have to be on GPT-5 Pro for you to ask a question and go away from the screen, because otherwise it errors out. And I feel like they're losing a tremendous amount of money from me, because most of the time I don't need Pro. I just ask it in Pro because then I can go from the screen and come back.
Right.
To the screen. Anyway, I'll pause that. Then there is obviously sort of all sorts of coding stuff. I use it very little for writing, except for research, because as we started out with, they're just really bad. But I have had this experiment for now a year and a half where I put one AI generated sentence in every one of my essays since then.
Oh, really? Interesting.
One. I only put one. And it's interesting because sometimes when I read back, it's very obvious, but sometimes I just can't see it. And I just kind of like that like, if you just do it as a very small sousson, it just kind of drops in and then you don't see it again and then it comes back. It's quite nice. It's, again, other things, PowerPoint generation for work, customer conversations. There's a negotiation we are having at work for like legal negotiation. Like you genuinely can use it as a filter for everything that comes through to you in life if you wanted to, that you don't want to do yourself. And I think the more you give it that, the more you're actually able to get out of it. I don't know if this is at all useful, or this is more like a therapy session between me.
No, I think this is a good friend. And do you have any situations where you just like there are certain problems or cases or situations where you've tried for the past a year or so some problem and it kind of fails, but then it kind of gets a little bit better. It's not quite failing. And how often do you keep on trying or like revisiting certain things that it's still not good at? Or is it one of these things where if it really is nowhere close, you're like, okay, I'm gonna I'm going to kind of set this aside? Or is part of your process constantly revisiting to see how these systems are getting better and can actually do more and more of the things that you're working on?
I used to have a long list of prompts that I tried regularly. I don't really do that as much anymore because many of it has succeeded now.
Okay.
But there are certain things that I like testing for more often. I feel like there are certain academic papers that I give it and ask questions about as one example, but it's getting really good at that, presumably because it's being trained on it. Writing, I test every new model that comes out. They're just not good.
And you're just constantly disappointed.
I'm constantly disappointed. I feel like now my disappointment has almost become endogenous to the model development itself, because I kind of know like the RL environment they're training these models on are not using good writing as one of the outputs, which is just sad. And I feel like we could get there, but somebody will just have to put a little bit of money, GPUs, and effort in that order against it, or talent. We will get there. I feel I'm reasonably confident, but just not yet. So those things it is getting better at. But more than I think the individual questions being asked repeatedly, what I find is like when I have sort of a new question that I want to get an answer from, I usually, if it's net new, I usually ask all the models. So I will ask whatever the Claude 4 latest one is, latest GPT, Google DeepThink, Kimi, the Moonshot one, which I quite like. I ask all of them and then sort of see the variations in the outputs. And sometimes it's quite interesting. Kimi, for example, is much weirder, including with writing, because it finds these weird nuggets and snippets and connects them together in a way that none of the others do. GPT, I feel like, has gotten much more factual, or at least like less prone to sort of sycophancy, at least the GPT-5. And it catches certain logical errors much smarter compared to sort of any of the other ones. It still falls prey to them. You know, the usual, like whatever, the boy and the dad got into an accident and the boy takes whatever
the surgeon or the doctor. Yeah.
I think anytime you have a variation in an easily understandable puzzle, all of these models fail at it, which is sort of sad, but also completely expected if you think of them in terms of sort of what happens inside them.
Right. I mean, and it's not even entirely surprising that a human would also potentially fail those kinds of things, where it's like, oh, I know the thing you're telling me, and then you kind of just like get into that groove, even though it's the opposite. I remember this is years ago when they used to, like when you would check in for a flight, they would ask you, do you have any of the following things?
Right.
Like in your bag. And you just say no or whatever. And it was like a default answer. And then one time someone asked me the opposite way, and I just kind of gave the default answer. He's like, let me say that again. And like, and it was one of these things where like, I basically had like admitted something because I was just in that. And then I quickly figured it out, but like that's not so different from this, which is like, you were expecting to hear a certain formula, and so you respond a certain way. And it could be the kind of thing where it could be easily solved by saying, let me say that again, or let me like pay a little bit more attention. Yeah. And then I clarify, no, I did pack this myself, or whatever it is, or whatever the opposite was, whatever I was supposed to say. So I feel like it's not, humans are all, and maybe we just have an expectation that these things should not fall prey to all of that, but it's not terribly surprising.
I mean, we've talked about this before, right? In the sense that like, these are weird things in the sense that they behave a little bit like humans and a little bit like computers. And then when they act too human, we want them to be more computer-like. When they act too computer-like, we want them to be more human. And it's a weird task that we put on them. It's like that old, what's that thing? A bat and a ball costs 105.
Yeah.
Whatever that puzzle is.
Yeah, like 110. And then, you get stuck in some like weird little,
And you ask immediately and people will say sort of instantly the wrong answer. But like, it's not because people are not capable of thinking through and working through that problem. It's just that immediately your attention goes to a couple of salient facts and you just construct this answer that seems to make sense to you. Unlike the models do that too, because they too have a different variant of what they call attention, and they pay attention to different salient facts. And there's this answer that seems to have a high probability distribution, and they sort of answer that. And you go like, no, that was wrong. The surgeon is not the boy's mother or whatever. Like, I missed that.
Yeah. And so what, I mean, is that part, like, is that an issue then? That we're still somewhat not entirely certain what we want out of these things, where we want them to be computational sometimes, but we also want them to be human sometimes.
Yes.
And sometimes we want them to be both at the same time. And so is there going to constantly be this weird mismatch where we don't actually know what we want out of these systems?
I think that is 100% true, because we don't, right? I mean, there are some people like me who kind of throw it at every problem that exists. And many of them, when it doesn't work, then you move to something else, just like you Google an answer and then you move to something else. And there are people who kind of go like, if you've ever kind of talked to companies that have not adopted AI, and you talk to their engineers and you're like, hey, you should sort of try it out, they would kind of go like, what would I even try it out for? It's a really hard problem because you can't just like pre-commit to trying it out for something. You just have to try it out and play, and then you will know what makes sense to you as to what to use it for. This is also like, it's a bigger problem because this is why top-down impositions of use an AI in your company type stuff has not really been that successful. Like individual productivity, I think, is pretty high through the roof in some ways, but collective productivity is not, because it's really hard to kind of get the fruits of all of that to connect together in an organizational level. So you would see weird things like every individual saying, I am, I don't know, 2x as productive, 3x as productive, 5x as productive. And collectively in the organization, it might just be flat or up by like 10% or something, because there's a bunch of leakages throughout the system. So similarly, nobody quite knows what to use it for beyond as like an individual crutch for the things that they already know it works at. Like, I work in marketing, I'm going to get it to write copy for me. Wonderful. But is writing marketing copy the defining bottleneck for any system in your company? Sometimes yes, but most of the time no. Similarly, like, I'm going to use it to write my boilerplate functions. Great. But is writing boilerplate functions the core defining bottleneck? No. What this means is that as a whatever senior engineer, you can now work 5 hours less, which is good for you, but it doesn't sort of expand out into any meaningful sense. And part of that is just because people are not applying it to all of these different things, right? Like one of the essays that I wrote was like, I looked at my screen at some point and I saw like 4 little Codex windows sort of popping up, dotted around. And I was like, this is what people's lives are going to be like in several years down the line, right? You have a bunch of
Right, which is
AI
why I was
agents.
saying, like, you're sort of like the advanced scout for what these things are going to be. Yeah, what jobs are going to look like.
They will become more like video games. Then, like, people will do whatever the Minority Report style stuff maybe to kind of move things, and like, that agent did it wrong, I should fix that, or this agent did it right and I should tell it to continue. It gave me 4 options, I should pick option 3 instead of 2. Eventually, will that also get taken by AI? Maybe, I don't know. But as long as there's an interface for a human, it becomes more and more play-like, and it should. So sometimes there's a document you need to review and then you can quickly do it and give input. But just like almost all executives live in their email as their primary, like, that is their job to, to work on email. Yeah. This is the next step that this will be your job to do these, 17 boxes, sit like a Goldman's trader with 6 screens and kind of go one by one. I don't think you will be able to do that.
Do you find that kind of, like, is that more enjoyable? Like, is it going to be one of those things where everyone's job is trending towards what you just described, and that's going to be bleak and horrible, or people will actually find that more rewarding and exciting, or it'll be really dependent on the specific thing you're doing? How do you think about that?
I think this is a philosophical point. I mean, there was a time way back in my life when I did trading for a living, like I ran a small hedge fund. And one of the reasons I stopped doing that was because it felt too much like a video game. So I feel like this is the world's revenge against me. But I think it is exceedingly enjoyable for a certain type of person at a certain time. Like, do I enjoy doing it in the moment? Yes. Is this what I want to be doing? If you kind of step back and look at it, probably not. There's this wonderful book by a gentleman I disagree with about almost everything called Kirkpatrick Sale. He's a semi-Luddite. I don't know how he would characterize it, degrowth person. And the part that I agree with him in that entire book, he wrote, entire book is called Human Scale. The part that I disagree with him the part that I agree with him is only about the fact that, like, humans need things to be at human scale sometimes, right? Like, it's just kind of, if everything is abstracted out, it's really hard to kind of deal with it. And playing as a video game is a little bit like, it's too abstract, right? It's like taking the Marxian dictum to its extreme, kind of saying like, you're so far removed from the things that you're meant to be doing that you're entirely abstracted. I mean, a set of people that hate management, and so do I. It's not fun to context switch every 30 seconds and kind of click. It's very energizing because video games are energizing, but in the moment, as opposed to sort of on reflection.
So interesting.
I mean, I would like to, let me put it this way. I would like to do it for short stints of time. If this was my entirety of life, then I would feel a little cheated.
But it sounds like with AI, that is becoming the majority of what you're doing.
I think more and more, I think this is the paradox where normatively, I'm not sure, but practically, yes. I think This is the future that is in vogue for us. That's been set, because if you have any job that deals with multiple moving parts, which every job does, almost by definition, this is kind of what you would be doing, right? Even if you think about the most deep thinking type jobs, research, you can simultaneously pursue multiple avenues of
Right.
thought.
And there's like different roles that you're playing within this, like, within a single job.
Correct.
Like, it's not
So
just-
anything can be decomposed and
Mhm.
put into multiple boxes. You can iterate and expand and like do this. Most people just don't do it because they don't have to and they don't like it. You know, I've had conversations with like both researchers and engineers who say, no, I want to kind of focus on a problem deeply. But in some sense, that focus on a problem deeply breaks down into like, I want to go down a bunch of rabbit holes and
Right.
come up and so on. And if you speed that up, would that be better? I'm not sure, because the extreme accelerationist argument is that, yes, it will be better because you will now discover drugs like next faster. But the human scale argument is like, no, it does take a little bit of time before you yourself grok things. So sometimes you have to step back. And the only method that I've found works for me right now is to keep my phone on my desk and go for a walk.
Interesting. Right. Because it's one of these things I was reading. So yeah, someone was writing about this thing of like, right, if there is an activity you truly enjoy, like research or thinking deeply about something, and you're basically using these tools to kind of get that done faster, as opposed to spending more time doing the things you want. Like, what is the point, or like, are you kind of missing the point of using these tools and being able to, and maybe this is not quite what you're saying, but being able to still take that step back and think deeply, take a walk. Maybe that's valuable. I don't know if this is kind of at odds with what you're saying or not, but
I don't know is the answer. I mean, what we're saying is in something like, this is what the world's gonna look like, or at least on the margins, more jobs will end up looking like this if they haven't started already. That is true. On the margin, this is not an easily net positive for everybody. Also true in the sense that like, if you tell people to start doing it tomorrow, many people will actively dislike it. Because most people already hate multitasking.
Yeah.
So this has kind of taken that to an extreme. So it works for a very small subset of people. Also true. That said, when our kids grow up, would they find it more enjoyable or would they just find this normal? Unclear.
Yeah.
I think and will this have negative and differentially negative impacts on other stuff that we care about? Almost certainly. Whether the net positives make up for it is the biggest question. But of course it will. Like, I mean, we've been arguing the differential negative impact of technology since Socrates, right? So it's kind of...
Yeah, I'm not sure where this leaves us, but these are good provocations, so I appreciate it.
I am glad to be provocative, but I think ultimately, I don't know, hopefully the net takeaway is not that like, it's great or it's whatever, but like, it is fun in the moment and you should try it out. I think this is one of our recurring themes over the years has been like the importance of play. And I have rarely found a domain where it applies as cleanly as AI, because you do get to like, you didn't get to play with cloud. I don't know whether you did. I didn't. It was not fun. Didn't really get to play with mobile. I know like games existed, but like mobile as a platform was not geared towards play per se. It's like, you could see your emails on a phone. Like it wasn't. Internet kind of was. In the
like early web,
days.
there was a lot of like, there was some playfulness there in terms. Yeah, right. This is kind of the next sort of playfulness.
But this is the first platform since the early internet where play is the way that you learn how to use it and push it forward.
I like that. That's actually really interesting. Yeah, it's a really good takeaway. That actually might be the perfect place to end. I appreciate that. This is a great conversation. Thank you so much.
Well, of course, man. Love chatting with you.